Hey everyone, James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about kind of stamp collecting versus what I'm calling kind of Tong gang. So, pu'erh is kind of created in my opinion, at least, semi-arbitrary categories. You could argue there's a historical basis for it, but I think in terms of actual consumption, it's certainly not created for a person based in the West, drinking tea mostly for themselves, which I suspect is the majority of my audience here. So it's something like 357 gram cake, kind of standard size. What is that? Well, it could be between 40 and 70 sessions or so, and so a Tong would be 7x that. So you're talking about like drinking a tea 280 to maybe about 500 times or so, if you're to do the math there. And so that's a lot of tea, and that's a lot of times drinking it. But I think in some cases it does absolutely make sense. I think a lot of this comes down to short-term versus long-term thinking, and if you really want to be drinking this tea for a very long time, potentially the rest of your life, or if you're seeing things in a more kind of short-term mindset. And I don't think there's necessarily any problem with either of these, but I do think it's important to kind of contextualize it and understand what we are buying for, especially when we're talking about quantity. So I mean, there's a couple things that are true too that I think will impact how people do generally buy. So I mean, part of it is because of the kind of just odd unit sizes of pu'erh. I suspect if people could buy different size cakes, and you could just be like, okay, I actually want 200 gram cakes of the 2004 Bianhao Iwu, people would end up buying quite differently than they end up doing. As it is, there's a lot of interesting creative ways that have come about in the last 6 or 7 years. Part of that probably goes to Choose You Like, as well as kind of associated acts in terms of splitting and quarter caking and whatnot, which has become a lot more standard practice than it was when I was first getting into tea. The interactive idea or the collaborative idea of splitting different cakes and stuff like that, that's been around for a long time, especially when it comes to pricier stuff. I think that stuff is great. I think it's good to do too. I think in terms of sampling and trying just a lot of different teas in the short term, this is a great way to go about it. You don't need to necessarily work in full unit sizes. I think when we're talking about cake sizes and especially Tong sizes, we are talking about someone that wants to be drinking such tea for a long time. And I think when you do have, I think that's something that you need a certain amount of experience to really know. And even if you do have, a couple of years of experience, you can definitely misfire on that. So kind of just going to be riffing a bit on those themes in this video. So let's see. There's one other thing that is, I think, worth noting, especially for people that are potentially in their early to mid 20s and just getting started with tea. Something that I would think about too, if I were to give myself advice from something like 12 or 13 years ago, is that the long term is hard to predict, and you don't necessarily know what you're going to be wanting to drink down the road. You might have some idea. You might have a pretty good idea, in fact, but it's hard to say exactly, I want to be drinking this 2006 specific cake then. People also generally get wealthier over time. Of course, this is averages. It doesn't happen to everybody, but people generally make more money as they get a little bit older. I know for myself that that is certainly the case, and that has allowed me to buy a little bit differently now as I am, 13, 14 years older than I was when the TDB blog actually was started. So I think those are kind of like important things to keep in the back of your mind too, in terms of like what your purchasing power is and how your consumption habits might change too. So I think importantly, when we're thinking about quantity, how often you drink certain teas matters a lot. We are basically thinking about the speed test here. And I think it's easy to have kind of like this imaginary pie in the sky dream of what our kind of tea hermit life would look like 10 or 15 years in the future. But I think I would rather make these decisions grounded in some sort of reality on the types of tea that we like to drink here and now. For one thing, for myself, I realized that, I really like raw pu'erh, but I also young tea just does not pass that speed test. I just never want to drink it, however the quality is. It's just not something that does particularly well. I might enjoy a young tea if someone serves it for me, but am I going to choose to drink that tea on myself? Almost never. In fact, I think the answer is virtually never. So it's like important to buy things that you actually like. Okay, so here are some quick pros and cons of buying in quantity. One, if you're buying something like a Tong, it doesn't have to actually be a Tong. It could be like, 3 cakes, 4 cakes, or whatever. You can enjoy a tea far more leisurely. It's also a lot cleaner if we're just talking about the long term. If you are trying to buy and age a single cake, that cake is going to end up to be a hot mess in not all that much time too. So really, if you are talking about kind of a long term, and especially of aging tea and drinking a tea 10 or 20 years in the future, you're either not drinking that tea very much, or you are buying multiples of them. So that's one reason to definitely kind of join more of the Tong side of things too. I think it's also a lot easier to sell in many ways. You don't have to end up doing weird things where you're splitting up the cake into lots of different samples. You can just be like, I have 5 cakes of this thing. Here's what I'm selling for this price if you do decide to unload it. So it's a little bit nicer in terms of liquidity in that way. And I think for a prolific tea drinker, if we extend that time horizon out, and I do think most of my audience is younger than myself at least, cake really isn't that much tea if we think about it. So it's like, yeah, that same cake that we're talking about, that is between 40 and 70 sessions. Okay, well in a year, that's a lot of drinking that specific tea. But if we think about it in terms of 10 years, for me, I have about 3 to 4 sessions a day, so we're talking about 3.5. That's average. Some days when I'm drinking with other people, that's quite a bit more. Other days when I'm just by myself, that's probably closer to 2. But nonetheless, when we're talking about 2 sessions per day, let's say, for a year, that's 700. But when we're talking about a full decade, that's 7,000 sessions. That's a lot of sessions. So it's absolutely possible to, a cake really isn't that much tea when we're talking about in the context of that many sessions. A lot of it is just simply time horizons too. Okay, but there are definitely some downsides to buying a cake to buying kind of in quantity as well. One mistake that I don't know if I saw fully fleshed out, and I don't think was fully fleshed out in my mind too, is cheaping out in terms of buying tea. So if you get it in your head that I must buy a lot of this tea if I want the tea, then there's a tendency at least to be like, well, okay, I could technically afford this pricier cake that maybe costs a few $100s, but I can't buy that same cake in a Tong quantity, so therefore I am going to buy this other tea that is a fifth as expensive, and I'm going to buy a full Tong of that. The problem is, maybe you don't want to drink that tea that is a fifth of the price, and the better solution was to just buy a single cake, or maybe 2 cakes of that pricier tea. So I think there is a real danger in terms of cheaping out and making the decision that's not going to ultimately pass the speed test because you are overly concerned with price. Mistakes, if you also buy a Tong, do become more painful, even if the cakes are potentially easier to sell. It's important to consider what might actually sell too, if you are actually considering doing that. Certain teas, like right now, XCH is having a hard time selling on the Western market. And so you really do have to mark those teas down quite a bit, and you're going to have to accept a loss if you do that. Mistakes are more painful because you simply have more of the tea there too. And the last con I have written down here is small consumption. Just doesn't go that well with buying a lot of a tea. When we talk about, I've in the past talked about the 3-gram game, which is kind of a fun idea of people that are sparser consumers, whether that means they have just really, really small sessions, or they're more weekend warrior types. If you're a small consumer, then your buying should reflect that as well. I wouldn't necessarily say that, I guess in some contexts, perhaps buying a Tong could make sense for a really small consumer, but 2.5 kilograms, that's 800, that's a lot of 3 grams there. That's something like 833 sessions, I think, if I'm doing the math correctly there. So you have to really think if that's what you do want or not. I mean, your rotation as a result would be a little more limited. Just some food for thought to think about there. I think if you really want to age a tea and live with it in the long term, then buying in quantity does make some sense too. I think stamp collecting and the quarter caking and stuff like that are fantastic, especially for learning. I think it's also definitely possible to drink very well for a smaller budget if you are more short-term minded. If you're thinking more in long-term, it's like, hey, I want to have this like really expensive 20-year-old boutique Iwu cake for the rest of my life. That's a fairly different calculation if you're talking about splitting a quarter cake with someone versus actually buying a full Tong. So I think I apologize for a little bit of the scattered nature of this episode, but wanted to get a lot of my different thoughts out there. I do have an article also covering these things that's probably a little bit more organized there, so go ahead, check that out on tdb.org, and I will see you all next time.